Hello, welcome to chapter 16 of the American Pageant. That's our textbook in case you forgot. We're going to talk about the South and the slavery controversy. We're on our road to war here, Civil War. Today we're going to be covering Cotton is King all the way to the burdens of bondage. And you have a rare photograph of slaves here. Rare because there wasn't a lot of pictures of slaves. People didn't usually waste their photography on that. So there are, a few if you did, but nothing like some of the other subjects at the time. So, cotton. Cotton is king. In 1793, we mentioned it before, the cotton gin made cotton a profitable entity or crop, and it also made slavery profitable. It was now something you could make money with. It wasn't just a luxury that the rich enjoyed. Planters began to buy more and more land and slaves to grow more cotton because of the textile industries here in America and then also in Britain had a thirst for cheap cotton, and there's a lot of money to be made. And so planters invested their money in land and slaves to the point where wealth was actually measured in land and slaves there. That's kind of in the South. How they measured, how powerful they were was how many acres they had and how many slaves they owned. In our money in 1860, there was about $11 trillion invested in slavery, which, to put it in perspective, that's about the current GDP of the United States. What we produce, every year, goods and services total, they had that much money invested in slavery in 1860. Like I said, that's adjusted to inflation for our money today. Cotton accounted for half of the value of all American exports after 1840. So half of the stuff we were shipping out of the country was cotton. In the 1850s, Britain's most important manufactured item was cotton cloth. I mean, the workshop of the world in Britain was centered in the textile industry, and clothes that were well made and cheap were very, very popular all across the globe. Britain imported 75% of its raw cotton from the South, and so there's a big infusion of British money into America. And so the South really kind of adopted this because it was an easier way to make money. It heavily influenced the South. It also benefited the burgeoning factories in the North too, because the North was trying to get their own factories going. They didn't have to pay the export tax. Well, we don't have that, but import tax. And so it made American factories operate at a much higher level, and they lowered their operating cost. The planter aristocracy. The South was more of an oligarchy, which is a government ran by the few. In fact, only 1,733 families actually owned more than 100 slaves. Slaves were so expensive and so worth a lot of money, that most people did not own slaves, and if they did, they had a handful. And so these wealthy planters, that we usually imagine the South and the movies and the antebellum romanticized view of it, like Gone with the Wind. Most families did not own slaves like this. They didn't toil in huge plantations. These people that owned these slaves sent their kids to the finest schools. And the government was also heavily affected by this planter aristocracy. They felt it was their duty. They were the lords, they were the knights of the South, to lead their people. And they had the strong sense to serve the public, but at the same time keeping their own interests in mind. And because of the Three-Fifths Compromise, they had national power. Uh, seven of our first 9 presidents were slave owners. Kind of puts that in perspective there. They loved to read Sir Walter Scott, who wrote about castles and manors, and they saw their plantations as being their own version of these castles and manors. And then the plantation wife commanded the female slaves. And so they kind of ruled as lords, and they had their fiefs. It's almost feudalism, and knights in shining armor, except for it's in the South, and they're wearing seersucker suits and drinking mint juleps. So here's the average price of slaves over time. You can see in 1804 they're about $300 a slave. You see a spike in 1807 because after that's when foreign slave trade was banned in the United States. And then the two noticeable spikes you see there is the Panic of 1819, the Panic of 1837, where the country's in a lot of debt, the money's not doing well, and so slaves were a valuable commodity. And then they slowly rose until the dawn of the Civil War, which is around $800. But right before the Civil War, because of fears of what was going on with the election of Lincoln, they did drop a little bit. The price of a slave based on their age. The Old South is kind of new, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia. The New South was kind of, this land breaking, settling frontiersmen of Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas, Texas, Tennessee, even. And you can see just kind of the curve. The most valuable were the New South males, and the value peaked at around, in the late 20s, early 30s. Kind of the same for males in the Old South and females and all that stuff going on there. And then this is the wealth in slaves in trillions of 2011 dollars. Peaked, it looks like, in about 1819. We had over $12 trillion worth of money invested in slaves in our money. Also peaked in 1837. Once again, once there was an economic downturn, slaves became very valuable commodities. They didn't, the value increased. And then, by the turn of the Civil War, the turn of the mid-century, it's about $11 trillion. This is a painting by Edgar Degas, the interior of a cotton bureau in New Orleans, for you Yankee y'alls. And here's some cotton harvest going on in the South. Steamboats in the back and slaves toiling in the fields. So the slaves of the slave system. The quick profits led to land butchery. Cotton is terrible for the soil. It depletes of its nutrients. And so what they did is they just planted a bunch of cotton. It didn't go well. Maybe they did all right for a little while, and then the crops didn't do as well. So then they just moved west and cleared forests and planted more. It's kind of like slash and burn, but not so much ecological terror like it is in the Amazon. The economic structure of the South became increasingly monopolistic. Basically, cotton was king. It was the quote. Small farmers sold to planters and then moved west or north. They could get a lot more money for their little small plot. Plantations consolidated, and they could go get cheap land out west or even up north. The whole system is very financially unstable. The costs for slaves, for land, and cotton all fluctuated. And with the price of cotton going up and down, it could mean a great profit one year or of huge loss another. Over speculation led to ruin to many. People buying land they thought was going to be good and it turned out to be swampy or didn't grow well. And so people lost money that way. And then the southern system discouraged immigrants to sell there as well because they have slaves. It's hard to get land. And so there's not a lot of immigrants. There's not as much cosmopolitan nature in the South as it would be the North, especially the cities or even the West. This is the real price of owning a slave in our money. And you can see it steadily rose, and then you'll have the spikes again once for the economic depressions. But it peaked with a slave being worth about $23,000 in our money. No, I know it's 2016, but close enough. So the white population of the South was as follows, from smallest to largest. You have wealthy slave owners who are very, very small proportion of the population. You have the less wealthy slave owners. These people don't own a majority of the slaves, but they made up a majority of the masters. So they're the majority of the slave owners, but the wealthy slave owners own the majority of the slaves. But there's only 1,733 of them. Non-slave holding whites, 3/4 of Southerners, did not own slaves. They were expensive. They cost $23,000 in our money. That's a very expensive commodity to have or business venture to invest in for most people. And so most whites in the South did not own slaves. And so these, romantic views of the South that everyone's owning slaves and they're, fanning themselves on the plantation porch, drinking iced tea in the slaves' toil, is pure fantasy for most of reality in the South. These whites supported slavery, though, because they wanted eventually to own their own slaves and achieve their own version of the American dream by moving up in society. And being upper or middle class meant owning slaves. It was a way you could define success in the South in the antebellum period. The less prosperous non-slave holding whites were known as poor white trash or hillbillies. The hillbillies actually supported the North because they were looked down upon and they weren't well liked by the South. They lived poorer than slaves, but at least they were free. Here's it shows you the proportion of people that owned slaves. Most, if they did own slaves, 105,000 slave owners actually only had 2 to 3. You can see that these, upper class, these upper echelon of owning slaves, less than 10,000 people actually owned 50 or more slaves during this time. And usually the statistics you get is around 1850 or 1860. Like I said, pre-Civil War. Here's a map from the book that shows southern cotton production in 1820, which was limited to, really the Carolinas and other places, and then exploded in 1860 to open up the New South, Louisiana, Arkansas, the Mississippi River Valley, Mississippi, Alabama. And that was where the civilized tribes were removed by Andrew Jackson, later Martin Van Buren with the Trail of Tears, was this land, and they were in the way of progress, in the way of cotton production. This is showing where most slaves lived in 1820. Originally was for tobacco crops, rice crops in South Carolina, and eventually there's a huge shift to the west, and you can see that slavery becomes more and more entrenched by 1860 in most of the South. The exception being the mountainous territories or counties of Virginia, which eventually would break away and become West Virginia. You can also see in 1820 there's still slavery in Illinois and Indiana, and that vanishes by that time. So free blacks, they didn't have a lot of options for work, so they had to go live in the cities. Many of them settled in New Orleans or lived in the border states, which would be Kentucky, Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, even Missouri. They numbered about 250,000 in 1860, which is a pretty small chunk compared to the 4 million slaves that were owned in 1860. Many were biracial. They were freed offspring of the slave master. It was common for slave masters to have their relations with some slaves, and then they would have illegitimate children that were biracial, and they would favor those kids, and eventually they would, free them because they were their own children. Some African Americans even owned their own slaves. It was a status symbol, and so there were instances where freed blacks owned other blacks. There's instances of the Cherokee Nation. The Cherokee Nation, they owned more slaves than any other tribe in the United States. Free blacks generally were not liked in the North and the South. They didn't really have a place. They didn't have freedom. They didn't have rights. They're kind of like the heading says, they were slaves without masters. Yes, they had freedom, but they didn't have economic freedom. They didn't have political freedom, and they're kind of stuck. In the South, free blacks were prohibited for having certain jobs. They were prohibited from testifying against whites in court. They couldn't vote. They weren't really citizens. They were known as the third race because they were kind of in this limbo middle kind of ground. They could be forced back into slavery, especially if they didn't have the right paperwork or they just had bad circumstances. They could have been forced back into slavery. Free blacks also numbered about 250,000 in the North. Many states barred their entrance into their land. So actually a lot of them moved to Canada, where African Americans had a big influence on actually the development of hockey, the national sport of Canada. Well, the most beloved one of the national sports is actually lacrosse. They were banned from education in the North. And then you have a lot of racism up north, especially from the Irish. The Irish hated blacks. They wanted to stop the spread of slavery for racist reasons. They just didn't want them around. And there's a lot of people that were very strong supporters of back to Africa movements, that let's just take all these slaves, free them, and then send them back to Africa. Abraham Lincoln subscribed to this for a long time in his life. He saw it as the only solution to get people to get along in America. White Southerners liked the blacks as an individual, but they hated the race. I mean, they became very close with many of their slaves, especially some of the house slaves, and they became, they were raised by African American nannies, and they loved them as members of the family, but as a race, as a whole, they couldn't stand them. And this is that weird, peculiar contradiction, kind of in the essence of Thomas Jefferson, who was the man of contradictions. The white Northerner professed to like the race, but disliked the individual. So in the North, they liked black people. Supposedly, they wanted freedom, but they didn't like the individual African Americans working in the factories with them. Legal importation of slaves ended in 1808. Britain did this in 1807 as well. And so you have the West African Squadron that went around freeing thousands of slaves. This is the Royal Navy's doing this in Africa. This is a picture of actually an African slave that was captured on the Congo shore, which was waiting to be shipped and sold to America. And this practice really ends after 1808, 1807. Legal practice. There was smuggling still going on. Because the price of, they called black ivory, was so high, slaves were being smuggled into the South still. Many slaves were the offspring of slaves already in America, and so breeding became very important. You couldn't bring in foreign slaves legally, and so a lot of white owners encouraged slave marriage. They encouraged slaves to have kids because that was increasing their wealth and their power, and they could sell those on the slave market. Slaves increased through natural reproduction. Planters regarded slaves as major investments. In their money, they had $2 billion invested in slaves. That was more than all the railroads and factories in America combined. It was just substantial how much money was invested in other people, which is worth about, they were worth about $1,800 in their money for each slave, which is a prime field hand, a male, late 20s, early 30s. Like I said, in our money, it'd be about $23,000 to $25,000. The dangerous jobs were given to hired hands, not slaves. Working with, dangerous animals, somebody you could pay a salary to go do that because a slave was worth too much money. Slave auctions, sadly, were ran by like livestock sales. They would oftentimes strip slaves naked. They would poke and prod. They would check their teeth. They'd make them pick up boxes and jump and show off their muscle tone and show off their back to show that they had not been whipped, that they were good slaves. They weren't what they were called uppity. And so it's very sad and just huge degradation. And this is really, it's a sad chapter. It's a black eye in American history, but it is our past, and we have to learn from it and move forward. Families were often separated. Slave vows for marriage used to say, till death or separation do us part. And so families would be torn apart. Kids would be taken away from their parents. Husbands and wives sold off because if the slave master died in the will and the kids didn't care. And so there's so much tragedy and hardship and just awful, awful evilness going on with slavery. Slavery was marked with hardship, with misery. They worked from dusk until dawn. If there was a full moon, they had to work. They worked almost the entire year. They got a little bit of time off for Christmas. There's no money. There's little chance of freedom. I mean, working day after day, sun up to sundown, and not receiving a paycheck. Just incredibly demoralizing. Being humiliated, being treated as a second-class citizen. Not even that, being treated as an animal a lot of times. There was very few comforts for slaves. Families were torn apart. And so extended families had to help raise children. And so you have what's called the Black Belt. It was a region of the South where most slaves were concentrated. It stretched from South Carolina, which had the highest concentration of African-American slaves of any state, to Georgia and into Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana. Even through all of this hardship and evilness and just difficulties, blacks managed to sustain a family life in slavery. Blacks formed their own religions from a mixture of their Christian and African elements. They really took to Christianity, loved the stories of Moses and Exodus, and so it really kind of gave them comfort that for a slave, death was a release from bondage. For a slave, death was, a chance to be equal in heaven. They held on to their music, their dance, their folk stories, their clothes, even their food, which is heavily influenced on a modern American culture today. Then you have a style of preaching in which the congregation responds to the preaching remarks with an amen, which is responsorial, where, it's very typical, we would say, a Southern black church. So here's a slave auction, families being sold off, and just terrible, terrible stuff going on. Abe Lincoln said in 1865, whenever I hear anyone arguing for slavery, I feel a strong impulse to see it tried on him personally. This is some of the contraptions, the cruelty of slavery. Those that tried to escape had to wear this neck harness that had bells on it. So basically, they could not be quiet anymore. They could not sneak off. I've seen other ones where slaves had to wear a collar and they had big metal things all around their head so they couldn't run through the woods. They would get stuck in the branches. Many slaves were shackled. And yes, slaves were whipped as well. And here's a painting of the cruelty of slavery as well. All the just toiling and hard work. It's a picture of a slave nurse and her young white master. And she pretty much would raise that girl, and they became very, very close. That was kind of the contradiction of the South. So the burdens of bondage. Slaves were not permitted to read because reading brought ideas, and ideas brought discontent, and so it was illegal to teach slaves to read and write. Slaves resisted servitude in several ways. Some of them worked slowly. Some of them purposely broke their tools. They sabotaged equipment. Some stole food and goods from the big house. We learned about Denmark Vesey with the slave revolt in Charleston in 1822. But widespread revolts, not too many in American history because they were so just trampled upon confidence wise. They just knew they weren't going to succeed. And so it was very rare for slave revolts to happen. The worst of which was Nat Turner's Rebellion, which was a Southern rebellion against slavery led by Nat Turner. The rebellion was defeated. There were 60 that were killed. But because of this rebellion, um, slave codes were strengthened in the South. They took away even more liberties, what liberties they had, and opportunities for African Americans because it really scared the whites, especially in a place like South Carolina. Even though Nat Turner's rebellion is in Virginia, excuse me, but in South Carolina they actually outnumber the whites. Enslaved African slaves aboard the slave ship Amistad rebelled and took control in 1839. They landed in America and sued for peace. It landed in Long Island, but Africans were eventually returned to Sierra Leone. And John Quincy Adams, the former president, argued on their behalf in the Supreme Court in 1841 and won a huge success. Gave them the right, the ones that could, to stay here with a brilliant moving argument before the Supreme Court. And the Africans returned to the British colony of Sierra Leone instead of being returned to bondage. Very good movie starring Anthony Hopkins about that incident too. In South Carolina, in Charleston, freed blacks and slaves had to wear tags to mark that they were slaves or they were free. They were treated like a dog. They had to wear badges. It's very similar stuff that we're going to learn about in the Civil War. And it's just terrible, terrible, terrible stuff. The nation sinned greatly, and many people thought that an atonement for this sin was coming, and they saw the Civil War eventually as that atonement. So if you have any questions, put them in the comments. We'll talk to you later.